welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Last week we started looking at the secret Gnostic Gospel of John. We talked about how John was challenged by a Pharisee and his confusion about what the Pharisee had said. He was being told by the Pharisee that Jesus was leading him astray. He went off to contemplate everything and the direction of his life, and he ended up having a vision. He left the experience feeling really renewed and whole again. Well, he also, not only did he get to see the truth about the fact that life exists and he remains, and that is the truth and it will always be that way, but he also asked questions and he got answers about the creation of existence. And we went into quite a lot of detail about that in last week's episode. We covered the source of creation, the creation of the very first thing that came out of that source, and that very first thing was Barbelo. Barbelo was an androgynous godlike essence who is considered in the Gnostic tradition to be a womb from which all other creations or beings or everything else originates from. If you haven't heard part one, you can find a link to it in the description for today's episode. But feel free to go back and have a look at that if you need to catch up, because we're actually going to be continuing on today with the rest of the vision and information that John saw that is captured in the Gnostic Gospel of John. And I give you a lot of background as to the difference between the Gnostic Gospel and the canonized Gospel that appears in the Bible under the name of John as well. And also I give you part one, which is basically the creation of the very first thing. So we're going to be picking up where we left off. And so, you know what? Let's just do it. So the source of all creation has at this point enacted two separate things. Firstly, they have created themselves, and then they have created the very first thing, which is Barbelo. When I say that Barbelo is the very first thing, it's because whatever created Barbelo, it's referred to as the One. It's also referred to in Kabbalah as being that which shall never be named, or which has no name. And if you translate the Bible correctly, that very first sentence that appears in Genesis does not actually say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's just the way it's been mistranslated. If you translate it word for word from ancient Hebrew, which is the language it was written in, into English, what it actually says is, in the beginning, that which shall never be named, or which has no name, created God. Now, Barbelo might be the God that was created. Barbelo was the very first thing that was created by this concept that Gnostics call the One, which has an elaborate description that demonstrates that it's everything and nothing at the same time, and that nothing preceded it, and that it was nothing, and it appeared nowhere, and yet it was everywhere. So I really do suggest that you go and check out part one if you need to make any sense out of that. But from this point on, having enacted those two tasks of creating itself and then having created Barbelo, that source of all creation, which is referred to as the One, goes on to be called the Father in the Gospel of John. And so when I refer to the Father, I'm talking about the source of all creation as translated in the Meyer translation of the Gnostic Gospel. And I find my translations on a website called gnosis.org. It gives you a variety of different options of translations into English from the different Gnostic Gospels. And I've just chosen Meyer because I know that it is very well respected, and also it often captures the emotive element that is part of the writings as well, which I think is really helpful for us to understand the depth of sentiment that went into what can sometimes be really confusing writings. So in the rest of the gospel, Pretty much. The source of creation is referred to as the Father, and Barbelo is referred to as the Mother. And that's the reason why Barbelo is considered to be the womb of all creation, because everything originates from her in that way. The conception of creation comes from the Father, and the vehicle of that creation is the Mother. What happens next in the Gospel is that the Father gazes at Barbelo, and by doing so, Barbelo is ignited by a spark of light. And that spark is the divine conception of the very first life. It's the child. So the spark is the only child of the mother-father connection, and it symbolizes a unique and divine creation. Now you'll notice that I called the child it. Well, so does the Gospel, and I found that to be really interesting. The child has not been assigned a particular gender. In fact, the Gospel continuously refers to the child as it rather than he or she. And it goes to some lengths to emphasize the point that the original source was the Father, which is kind of male, and the first emanation was the Mother, which you would assume is female. But the child is without gender. I just think it should be something that we should remember. Androgyny and genderless themes run right throughout the Gnostic teachings, and so it's likely to be relevant in lots of ways as we continue to examine other Gnostic principles as time goes on as well. Because now that I've started, I'm going to try and infiltrate pretty much everything. So this Gospel of John describes the child as being pure light, anointed with divine and perfect goodness. Perfection and completion are both attributes that are given to the child specifically. So the child is being called perfect and complete. The child asks to be given a mind, which is interesting, which is for the purpose of acting as a companion for the child, so the child isn't alone. Both the mother and the child were given a mind by the Father. So it looks as though the conceptualization of any kind of action originates from the source of creation, which is the Father, which is the one that shall never be named, which is the one that appears in the very first sentence of Genesis, if it's translated correctly, as being the one who created God. So the one is what existed before there was anything. And anything that has to happen originates from the one, but it can be manifested through Barbelo, the mother, because she's the vehicle. And so both the mother and the child were given a mind by the Father. And I think, I don't know, it was hard for me to be able to determine specifically, but I got the impression that it may have been a single mind that they shared, because the way that it's described in John, the gift of the mind creates an interconnectedness between the Father, the mother, and the child. And so it could be that it's a single mind, and that mind may even be a reference to the soul. I'm not really sure, but it appears to be something that is shared among them. So now we have a mind. And interestingly, the mind also then starts to ask for something. The mind asks for free will so that it can manifest and kind of develop independently. And it seems as though the entire event surrounding the first emanations of father and mother and child were kind of experimental, because the way that it's written in the Gnostic Gospel of John is when you create the child, suddenly there's something new, and therefore it has a new idea, and it has an idea of having a mind. And so you create a mind, and that mind then gets a new idea, which is an idea of getting free will. And so this all happens almost as though no one's expecting what's going to come next. And so with these requests, the requests are granted, and the mind gets free will. And then, of course, as that was created, it leads to something new existing, which then asks for something new or wills something new. And it kind of continues exponentially. And that's the reason why it grows and it grows and it grows. And all of this, according to John, happens in silence. But there's a section of the gospel that then begins to start expressing it in a way that sounds like it's the ability to manifest with the power of free will and with words. So words seem to appear somewhere through the gospel to demonstrate that this is something new. So we have the mind, we have free will, and then we have words, which are a method of expression. So then, in terms of creation, we have this scenario where there's a desire for something, there's a vehicle for something, there's an expression of something, and then it manifests something, which becomes an expansion of reality. And I found this to be a bit more interesting than you might think, actually, because what it seems to be talking about is how energy can be transformed through thoughts and expressions. Now, the reason why I'm talking about energy now is because in part 1, in last week's episode, it had been established that energy is the source of everything. And it all boils down to Einstein's special theory of relativity, where he's got his E equals mc squared. And E is energy, which equals m, which is mass, times c squared, which is the speed of light. However, it also appears that E equals mc squared is energy equals, or energy is the spiritual world, equals mass, which is the material world, multiplied by c squared, which is the speed of light, which may also be frequency. So spirituality equals materiality times frequency. This is something that has almost been proven in quantum physics. And so if that is the case, then the one is energy. And everything that energy does can be transformed through thoughts and expressions of those thoughts. So I couldn't help thinking as I was reading this part of the gospel about some of the catchy phrases that we hear about energy. For example, thoughts create reality, or energy flows where attention goes, and things like that. I actually think that section of the gospel contains a very big clue for us today. So I'm going to return back to this concept of energy flows where attention goes later on in today's show. I'm just going to put it aside for now so we can continue with the gospel, and then I'm going to revisit it. So at this point in the gospel, there appears to be an interconnectedness between the source of all creation, which is the Father, and the vehicle of creation, which is the Mother. So the Father is the one who creates life, and the Mother is the vehicle through which life is created. And the child is the very first creation of life. And the child has a mind and free will and all of the divine aspects of goodness and wisdom and power. And the child is made of pure light, which, as we discover during the examination of the Gospel of Thomas, which I've covered previously a few weeks ago, might actually be referring to frequency. So light may actually be frequency, because frequency is the determining factor that turns energy into matter, as I have just said, or turns matter into energy. And so it connects the spiritual to the material world depending on the frequency. So let's move on. There's another thing that appears in the gospel. We have a child of pure light that has 3 distinct attributes, and they are life, thought, and free will. The child also has been given 4 distinct powers by now, and they're described in John as being understanding, grace, perception, and thoughtfulness. Now, these 4 powers and they're described as powers. So understanding, grace, perception, and thoughtfulness are considered to be powers in the Gnostic Gospel of John. They sound a little bit like the four essential virtues that appear in Christian teachings with a bit of tweaking, but they also appear in tarot. In tarot, the four essential virtues are strength, which is represented by the Strength card, prudence, which is represented by the Hermit card, justice, which is represented by the Justice card, and temperance, which is represented by the Temperance card. The same is true for Christianity, which dates back to about 1 BC. But we can go back even further. The way that it seems to be described in tarot aligns with Christianity, and that dates back to the birth of Jesus, so around about 1 BC. But we can go back, and find that these virtues exist even earlier in Judaism and Islam. In fact, both Judaism and Islam have 8 distinct virtues that appear to be simple expansions of the 4 distinct powers that appear in the Gospel of John that align very closely to the 4 essential virtues. There's just more of them, and they can be condensed down. So some of them appear to almost overlap each other, so they could be condensed down into 4. They are very similar, whether it be the Judaic or or from the Quran. They are very similar to each other, those virtues, those 8 essential virtues, or those 8 virtues. But surprisingly, and so we're talking, maybe 100 years prior to 100 years BC or 200 years BC when the conception of those religions was taking place. But we can go back even further than that and find very sort of similar virtues as well that are described as powers in the Gospel of John. We can go back to the 5th century BC to the time of Confucius in China and find them there. Now, Confucius was a Chinese philosopher who lived in the 5th century BC, so 500 years, 400 and something years prior to the birth of Christ. And Confucius said that there are 4 essential or cardinal virtues that exist. And I think this is incredible. 5th century BC is a time when it wasn't that easy to cross between countries and live. You could give it a shot, but you'd often die trying to do so. So Confucius said that these 4 essential or cardinal virtues are Ren, which relates to benevolence or humanity, and that appears to align with temperance in tarot and Christianity. There's also Yi, which relates to righteousness or justice, and that aligns to the Justice card in tarot and also in Christianity. And then Li, which is about proper conduct or propriety, and that relates to strength in tarot or Christianity. And then Z, which is ZHI, which relates to wisdom, which then aligns to the concept of prudence as an essential virtue in Christianity and in tarot. And so those 4 essential virtues may have actually come from Chinese philosophy in the 5th century BC, long before Jesus ever existed, long before any kind of Abrahamic religion, whether it be Islam or Judaism or anything. And it has been translated into Judaism and also Islam, and then ultimately into Christianity. But the earliest we can find is in ancient Chinese philosophy. So that would indicate that it predates anything Jesus related. And so what that tells me is these 4 powers that belong to the child may also be very, very important things, because power and virtue. Does this mean that virtue equals power? That's the question that I'm asking. The Confucius virtues that I've just named are also considered in Chinese philosophy to be fundamental to leading a moral and harmonious life. Okay, and it does. It makes me wonder whether the clue here is that the four powers that are listed in Gnosticism that were given to the child that was pure and complete are actually a clue as to how to gain power. Is virtue power? Are they the same thing? So I actually did a bit of research to see if there might be a connection. And I looked at how language development across the world might have linked the concept of power to the concept of virtue. Okay. And what's interesting is that connections came up very, very quickly in my research. In fact, many ancient languages developed in such a way that applies to show that virtue was, at some point, considered to be synonymous with power. I found strong correlations in ancient Chinese philosophy, but also ancient Greek philosophy, and the development of Greek language as well, and also strong connections in the Abrahamic religions, depending on how they're being translated. So I'm thinking that this connection between power and virtue is something that we should remember. So I'm going to add this as a topic to sort of look at the end of this show as well. So now the gospel begins to sound a bit like we're peering through the lens of a microscope, and we're watching a single cell suddenly begin dividing into multiple cells that then also divide and then also divide and are beginning to expand. It's like everything is multiplying, according to John. There's an expansion of life and thought and free will taking place, and it's happening continuously. The next stage that we're able to see in development is the creation of what's called the four luminaries. So basically, this stage of creation is providing a framework for reality in a way. There are four realms that are created, and there are four angels that are created, and each angel is responsible for overseeing one of the realms. And that's the next thing that happens in John. So the luminaries are angels. And so I guess they're kind of semi-physical or somewhat visually perceivable. They seem to be the kinds of beings that can be perceived in some way. The first angel is called Harmazel. Now I'm going to butcher these names, by the way, so just giving you fair warning. Because, I'm not really good at all of this. But the first angel is Harmazel. And Harmazel is responsible for overseeing a realm related to grace and truth and the physical form. So the realm appears to loosely correlate with the essential virtue that I would recognize from tarot as being strength. The next angel is Oriel. Actually, I think it's Oriel. And Oriel is responsible for overseeing a realm related to afterthought, perception, and memory. This second realm seems to correspond with the essential virtue that I would recognize from tarot as being prudence, as appears in the Hermit card. And then the third angel is Davathai. And Davathai oversees the third realm relating to understanding, love, and idea. And compassion fits in this as well. So this realm appears to be very much about compassion and seems to fit with what I know in tarot about the justice virtue. And then the fourth angel is Elilith. And Elilith presides over the realm related to perfection, peace, and Sophia, which is a word that in Greek means wisdom. I think I actually made a mistake in a recent episode that I did where I was talking about theosophy, and I've had lots of people comment and correct me. And when you're really busy and you're trying to juggle lots of information, sometimes the words get mixed up. I may have actually accidentally said that Theo stands for wisdom, but actually Sophia is the word for wisdom. And so Elilith presided over that fourth realm relating to perfection, peace, and Sophia. And Sophia is a word in ancient Greek that means wisdom. Okay, so this fourth realm seems to be related to the virtue temperance, from what I understand of it in tarot. These are loose kind of correlations, so it may not be exact. And after all, tarot is something that has been constructed based on ancient philosophies, a variety of which may have been merged together and may not all be exact. And the same goes for Christianity as well. It could just be a merging together of lots of different things. And so they don't have to be perfect fits, but they do seem to align closely enough that they may have actually evolved from this early thought of the four realms and those four luminary angels that oversee those realms. So after these four realms are created, then there also appears to be this manifestation of three additional realms for each of the luminaries, which makes a total of 12 realms that exist. So 12 realms, which means 12 concepts of reality, because a realm comes from the same root word that reality does. And so I'm assuming that that is what we're talking about here, that there are 12 realms or realities that exist at this point in the gospel. Each realm has components of cosmic hierarchy and structure according to the gospel. I have to say that whilst there was no explicit reason given in the Gospel of John that I could find that would connect the 12 cosmic realms described in the Gospel to the 12 zodiac constellations that are used in astrology, I did wonder if they might be the same thing. I'm not sure if it's likely because, yes, there are 12 zodiac constellations that astrology does use and that are mapped for that purpose, but there are actually around 88 constellations that have been discovered and that are used in astronomy to map the cosmos. And so it might just be a coincidence that there are 12 zodiac signs and 12 realms that appear in the Gospel of John. Or it could be that the 12 constellation zodiacs are actual zodiac constellations are relevant. This is something that I wasn't able to ascertain from what I understand so far. And there might be someone watching or listening who actually knows more about this aspect of the 12 realms and can potentially fill me in with comments or something like that. Because if there is more information, please do comment. I'd love to know, even if it means I end up going down yet another rabbit hole. So we've got these 12 realms that are three assigned to each of the four luminaries that they oversee. And within the realms, there's this concept of Sophia, and Sophia relating to wisdom. All of these angels and all of these realms and the various offshoots that derive from there all came from the single child, and they're all interconnected aspects of male and female principles. And so as everything appears to be androgynous and has an equal amount of male and female principle associated with it. And so I guess you could say, if you're looking at it in a nuts and bolts way, the way that we would think of it now, if you've got an aspect of you that's male and an aspect of you that's female, you would want those two aspects to be consulting with each other before you made a decision on anything, because if you just went forward with the male and ignored the female, then you'd get a lopsided outcome. And the same would happen if you just went forward with the female and ignored the male principle. Well, that's exactly what happened next, because one of these offshoots or realms, it's difficult when we get to this point to know exactly what Sophia was. But one of these beings didn't consult with the male counterpart, with the male principle of her existence, despite the fact that she had both male and female. She went out on her own. And this was Sophia, who was the representation of wisdom. And she decided, in all of her excitement of existing, that she was going to create another being like herself, perhaps to have as a companion. But she didn't consult her male principle. And so she basically did a boo-boo, and she created an imperfect being. She had deviated from the divine order of how things work, and this imperfect offspring was misshapen when it appeared. Its structure didn't make any sense because it was sort of just imperfect. In the gospel, it's described as taking on the form of a snake, but with a lion's head and eyes like lightning. So yeah, it was kind of chaotic and unnatural. Sophia realized that she'd made a mistake, and she tried to hide her mistake, which kind of proves that she felt a sense of shame from having made this mistake. She gave this being that she had created a name. She called it Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth actually becomes a key figure in Gnosticism from this point on. Sophia hides Yaldabaoth on a throne in the middle of a whole bunch of bright clouds and hopes that nobody will find him. But Yaldabaoth disappears because Yaldabaoth is imperfect and doesn't sit still, and he goes out on his own. He creates the material world, and he gives it a structure of a combination of lightness and dark that is constantly interplaying in such a way as to make perfection impossible. Because you see, when lightness and dark interplay, you never get perfect light or perfect darkness. And because Yaldabaoth is imperfect, because he was created imperfectly, he is incapable of creating perfection. So he's incapable of creating perfect light. Can you see how it's all sort of starting to turn into a story here? So Yaldabaoth divides the material world into 12 aspects, and here he creates 7 kings. The sun is one of those aspects representing light. So he did get something right there. But the others are a mix of light and darkness, and they seem to blend into all kinds of things that I'm not sure that I fully understood, because this section is, some of it is poetically written, and I don't think I necessarily needed to understand every word that was stated. But what I was able to ascertain is that Yaldabaoth, being as imperfect as he was incapable of creating perfection. And so he kept manifesting and creating, and he created this mix of elements that involved lightness and dark, and they weren't perfectly light and they weren't perfectly dark. And it just kind of created a bit of a mashup. There are 7 dark powers that appear in the Book of Mary, which I've also covered, and in a previous show, that appeared to have also been created by Yaldabaoth, along with the sun and Adam's sons, Cain and Abel, and lots of other characters that appear in the Bible. So it could very well be that Yaldabaoth, who is also referred to as the Demiurge, may also be the Old Testament's Yahweh. Although I think there's a conflict that appears later in the Gospel, which I haven't gotten to, but we'll see. So Yaldabaoth created lots of things that appear in the Bible. And so there is a possibility that Yaldabaoth might actually be another name for Yahweh, or is interpreted by his creations as being Yahweh. And Yahweh in the Bible is represented to be the Old Testament's word named for God. And Yahweh was a bit deranged. Yahweh was bloodthirsty and cruel and jealous and all kinds of things like that. And it appears that Yaldabaoth is very much the same. Yaldabaoth appears to be a bit deranged. He lacks mindfulness, and he just keeps giving birth to new entities that seem to be well below the standards of divine angelic presence. So they lack the divinity they lack the angelic element. They lack the perfection and the good and the light and the completion. And so I guess he's getting frustrated. He just keeps trying to create something better. And he just gets nastier and angrier as he continues to do so. And so he sounds an awful lot like Yahweh. And according to the Gospel of John, he also lacks the understanding of enlightenment. So I guess if he lacks enlightenment, then everything that he creates would also lack this concept of enlightenment. And there is this little tidbit in the Gospel that I found kind of interesting, actually. In various passages of the Gospel of John, the Gnostic Gospel of John, Yaldabaoth claims that he is God. And in one particular passage, he makes this claim in what appears to be pretty much a word-for-word match to what appears in one of the 10 Commandments of the Bible. What Yaldabaoth says, and this is a direct quote from the translation, Yaldabaoth says, "I am God, and there is no other God besides me." Isn't that something? That's exactly the same as one of the very first, it may even be the first commandment that appears in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy, I think, is where it appears in the first instance. So isn't that something? So we've connected now this Gnostic Gospel of John and this concept of Yaldabaoth, who actually was a mistake, a misshapen creation by Sophia, who forgot to consult her male principle before she went out willy-nilly. And so she created this misshapen being called Yaldabaoth, who went out on his own and was just bouncing around the cosmos, creating imperfect things. And rather than creating pure beings of light, he was creating things that are hybrids of light and darkness that just were so far from perfect, and then getting frustrated because he can't seem to figure out enlightenment. So at this point in the Gospel, Sophia realizes that she's lost her Yaldabaoth and she begins to repent. She goes through a pretty complicated process in the Gospel. And she's almost restored. She kind of gets reprimanded, but she's almost restored to her previous position of hierarchy, but not quite. She kind of repents and she does get restored. She ends up in the 9th heaven, which is at a higher place than Yaldabaoth, but not quite as high as where she started. Meanwhile, Yaldabaoth is creating as many as 365 powers. Some of them are dark, some of them have elements of lightness. They're pretty much a mashup of good and evil, and none of them are perfect. Because he's imperfect, and because of that, he's incapable of creating anything that's perfect, no matter what he tries to do. And then the Gospel begins to talk about one of the creations, which is the creation of Adam, which seems to confirm that, in fact, Yaldabaoth is Yahweh from the book of Genesis. So at this point, this is the point where the canonized text of the Bible and the Gnostic version of events appear to collide. Because, as you can imagine, the Gnostics have an entirely different interpretation of how things went. The Bible, starts off very early in Genesis talking about the creation of heaven and earth and the way that transpires over the course of 7 days. And then it goes straight into the creation of Adam and the placement of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Well, yes, there's something similar that happens in Gnosticism in the book of John, but it is a little bit different. Yaldabaoth decides to create a human being in the image of God and with the likeness to himself and some of the other entities that he has created. He was hoping that this human image may give him the light that he needed to create divine perfection. So he created Adam with 7 psychical features. And that's the way it's described. It seems that it's like a combination of physical and also aspects of consciousness. The psychical features are a combination of soul aspects plus physicality. And these psychical features are as follows. So Adam is comprised of goodness, which is created of bone, forethought, which is created of muscle, divinity, which is created of flesh, lordship, created of marrow, kingdom, created of blood, jealousy, created of skin, and understanding, created of hair. And all of these different psychical features were lying around. So Yaldabaoth ordered his angels and his demons that he had created to put them all together into a constructed human. So while this is happening, Sophia obviously has realized that she's lost her Yaldabaoth, and she goes looking for him. She finds him, and she sends 5 of her angels to the material world to try and stop the madness that he's creating, because he's really out there. He's gone a bit nuts. Meanwhile, Yaldabaoth has created Adam and Eve, ultimately, and a whole bunch of other beings and the earth. And he puts Adam and Eve to work in a prison garden, which is the Garden of Eden. It's a prison, according to Gnosticism. Adam and Eve are oblivious about what's going on. They don't even realize that they're in a prison. But Sophia finds them, and her angels find them, and she sends them a message, which is via the serpent that appears in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So Sophia sends a serpent to talk to, or a snake to talk to Adam and Eve, and the snake, I'll just say snake, it's the same kind of snake, serpent, it's all interpretation. The snake Sophia wants the snake to tell Adam and Eve of the mistake that she had made and how to rectify the mistake. So this is very interesting because it kind of closes the circle between the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story and the reason why the Bible doesn't talk about things that happened prior to the creation of the heavens and the earth in its interpretation. Sophia is very aware of the fact that the mistake that she made is now having a compounding effect, and it's growing. The impact of it is growing exponentially. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and she's trying to find a way to stop it. So the snake, and it all happened because of wisdom, you see? So the snake approaches Eve and tells Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge. Well, the tree of knowledge is the tree of wisdom, to be able to restore the completion of wisdom. The snake is actually a hero in Gnosticism, and it represents Sophia's attempt to restore the divine wisdom to its completion so that it can undo some of the mistakes that she'd made. But then Yaldabaoth shows up, and the rest is basically history. Eve is blamed for everything, and Adam and Eve are both punished, and their offspring for the rest of eternity are punished. And that's where the Bible and the Gnostic texts seem to kind of coincide, where when Yaldabaoth shows up, it all goes to pot and everyone starts getting punished for it. And it apparently boils down in the Gnostic Gospel of John that Yaldabaoth was bitter about being less perfect than his mother, a bit like a Freudian kind of a thing. So all he needed was a couch and a good psychiatrist. Everything in Freud, according to Freud, relates to either sex or it can be blamed on your mother. and basically Yaldabaoth had that kind of an issue going for him as well. So there is plenty more in the Gospel of John. And I'm not going to go into it in today's episode because it starts to get really itsy-bitsy in lots of places. And so it would overcomplicate this particular episode. But the pinnacle difference between Gnosticism and the Bible's Christianity all appear to stem from the idea of Sophia. which is a word that doesn't appear anywhere in any of the Abrahamic religious texts. So, as according to Judaism and Islam and Christianity, Sophia doesn't exist, which is really curious because there's no explanation anywhere as to how did God become what God became in order to create the heavens and the earth. Well, that's because the story demonstrates that actually there was a process, but it involved the creation of God as well. And perhaps not even just one, perhaps a whole bunch of them. And we don't even know what the gods were. Were they physical? Were they spiritual? Were they entities? Could they have even been, what we now consider or speculate to be extraterrestrial entities? So there's no real explanation in the Bible as to them even being anything. God just sort of appeared out of nothing and suddenly had this bright idea to create the heaven and the earth. The Gospel of John describes it as though it kind of has a beginning, and it sort of, you can see the process unfolding. And the fact that Sophia doesn't appear anywhere in the Abrahamic texts is telling. And that is that either she never existed or that story is something that doesn't really want to be retold for whatever reason. Except there are some clues in the Bible that show that Sophia may actually have existed exactly as stated. And these are really telling phrases. So I'm going to read some of them out to you. The word wisdom comes up a few times in the Bible, and it's referred to as being female. So wisdom is referred to, and it's referred to as being female. And it says things in those phrases or those verses that describe wisdom that seem to very closely coincide with this Gnostic version of John. So, they can't hide anywhere, man, because I'm just going to keep scratching until I find something. For example, right, in Proverbs chapter 1, in verses 20 to 33, there are statements that are made relating to an event in which wisdom cries out in the streets. Okay, so wisdom is crying out for something. And could it have been that wisdom was Sophia crying out for Yaldabaoth to come back so that she could fix her mistake? Also in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 to 18, there's a dialogue that exists that relates to how wisdom is more precious than rubies. This could be about the importance of looking at wisdom as a whole as opposed to the rubies being a manifest. Or it could be this concept of the Garden of Eden, tree of knowledge, and what was missed based on the error that took place at the point of wisdom. Had wisdom been complete, then that precious, the most precious thing of all, would have been preserved. And finally, also in Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom speaks of her role in creation, stating that the Lord, and this is a verbatim, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. So wisdom is confirming that the Lord possessed her at the beginning, before he did any of the other stuff that's considered to be his early stuff. And so this is a pretty profound statement in Proverbs 8, because wisdom is Sophia, it seems, saying that I was created by the Lord, I was created by the One, or by the Father, before all of the other things that you see now, even the ancient things that appear in the Old Testament, were ever conceived. Now, interesting. This would indicate that wisdom, a female being of some kind, was created before God created anything else. Now, I'm not going to continue on with the part 3 episode of this Gospel of John, but I am happy to revisit this Gnostic Gospel of John in the future, in a future episode, if you would like me to. So I'm going to be looking out for your comments in any of the forums in which you participate, whether it be YouTube or listening on Spreaker or at KJRA or anything. Just leave a comment in whichever forum. It could be Facebook, it could be anywhere, where you're listening or watching. And in particular, if you're watching today on the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel on YouTube, please do leave a comment letting me know how you feel. I'm happy to continue on with this story, in particular because there's a curious overlap between the Abrahamic religions, Gnosticism, and the question of extraterrestrial life in the remainder of John. In Gnosticism, John claims that Eve was raped by Yaldabaoth, and the rape resulted in 2 sons. And in the Gospel, they're referred to, at least in the translation, they're referred to as Elohim and Yahweh. Except it also seems that Yaldabaoth may have been the Yahweh of the Bible. So there seems to be something a bit peculiar happening inside the Gospel of John. And the word Elohim is actually a plural word. So were there 2 sons? Was there twins and then Yahweh? Or was there something different? Because the raping of a woman is a very physical thing, and it's obviously it's not worded that way, but it appears to be that way in the Gospel, and that would indicate a physical being of some kind. The way that Yahweh is described in the Bible as being something that is physical, that has limitations, that is not something that can see all and be all and know all. And it's a very imperfect being as well. And for that reason, along with the plural definitions for Elohim, this would indicate that there was a family of entities that were running the world, and they sounded extraterrestrial. So I'm kind of curious about this, because Yaldabaoth also, to conduct himself in a way that appears to be like a rape of Eve that produces children, sounds like a very physical being as well. And so all of these things might need to kind of be scratched. The surface of it might need to be scratched to be able to understand it. And I think doing so might help to explain a few things that are still kind of hanging. However, I don't want this show to be devoted just to a single gospel again and again and again. So I thought I'd better stop it at 2 episodes. And I'll ask you what you would prefer me to do. So if you want more, just let me know and I will give you more. There are a few things that, we can probably begin to explain a little bit or speculate about, I think is probably more accurate, with regards to what we know about Sophia. For example, Marian sightings. There have been Marian sightings that have taken place for at least hundreds of years, and this is where people it involves people getting a visitation from what appears to be an impossibly beautiful woman of an angelic kind of form, who is loving and compassionate and sad, and is pleading with us to change our ways. And every time someone encounters this feminine angelic presence, they feel an overwhelming sense of mother. So in the modern day, we've got recent examples which include Chris Bledsoe, who I talk about a lot, who has stated more than once, even in his hypnotic regressions that he's done, that the lady in white visitations he experienced were visitations by the mother. And even just a few weeks ago, Jake Barber, the former Air Force Special Operations helicopter pilot, who went public and spoke to News Nation and Ross Coulthart, talked about an experience in which he felt he was unexpectedly overcome by a sense of mother that he believes was a spiritual manifestation of a divine compassion and sadness. This might actually represent a mother's regret. So if Sophia is the mother and her mistake has cascaded into this exponentially increasing impact of madness, where darkness has been created and the perfection of light has been sabotaged, does she feel the regret to the point where she continues to return back to humanity with her divine compassion and her deep sadness whenever she sees an opportunity to help us to change the direction that we're heading in, because she feels a sense of responsibility for that direction having occurred? Does she do this in a way in which she's continually, throughout the course of time, repenting for her mistake that she made right in the beginning? A full confession by me here, this is a very tempting question for me to ask, but I'm also interested in the concepts of Elohim and Yahweh as they're named in the Gnostic Book of John, because if the book is correct, then maybe the ancient alien theories are actually theories about a divine creation era. And that's the kind of thing that I want to get to the bottom of. And maybe the secret to everything is wisdom. So, before we end today's episode of Curiosity, let's look at the two things I wanted to revisit. The first is the concept of how energy can be created through thoughts and words. This is something that appears to have sparked the creation of light, but also of darkness. And so it stands to reason that if we are descendants of this divine spark, then we are simply chips off the old block, and can influence the flow of energy in the same way that our predecessors did. So in very similar ways, we really do need to collectively, or at the very least increasingly, try to channel our thoughts and our words, and I guess also our actions as well, because that's a manifestation of our thoughts and our words, to positive things. Even though we are being directed continuously towards negative things, and to try very, very hard to stay away from and spend less time delving into negative things that distract us from the possibility of creating a positive energy force. I know that on a micro level, positive things happen to me when I'm a positive person. They just do. When I serve others, my needs are always served. It may not be immediate, but I always see the reward of having served others, always. Sometimes it's in unexpected ways as well, but my needs are still served when I serve others. So there's a mirror there that appears to be energy-based. And when I live a life of believing in people, people tend to reinforce my beliefs in positive ways. But when I travel down the path of negativity, because of course I'm human and I do that from time to time, it does seem as though negative things follow me around. And so that's on a micro level, and I feel that myself. I've been able to see that myself. My dog's just coming to say hello. But on a macro level, it's very difficult to produce that tangible result that I can see on the micro level when I look at myself, because there are so many distractions, and those distractions are different for different people. I know myself, when I try to even as a content creator on the Ellie Dreams Under channel, when I try to create a positive shift on the channel, there will always be a small group of people who instantly reject it. It doesn't actually matter what it is. And you never know who they're going to be. So it'll be different people. They might argue about distracting points. They might try to demean me somehow, or they might try to demean some of the people who express support for me. Or they might just unsubscribe and disappear from the channel altogether, and go off and do other things. However, the weird thing is that every time they do that, they're almost always instantly replaced by other people, by new people who believe in the positive thing, or they want to try it out. It doesn't mean they're going to stay. They want to try it out. And so I think that there is something really valuable. This is something, because I try to spend my life paying attention to this kind of, to the things that are around me. It's about growing my awareness of everything. And I've noticed it on a personal level, but also as a content creator where I'm delving slightly into the macro level, where if you project positive things, you attract that positivity back, sometimes in unexpected ways, but you also, the negative, they could be perfectly nice people, but the negative energy that is within them in that moment repels them from the positivity. It's a very interesting concept. So I do think that there is something very valuable in the concepts of the early manifestations and how they occurred with simple thoughts and words in the Gospel of John. Perhaps we should be looking for the light in our thoughts and words. That's sort of something that I thought might be relevant to take out of today's show. Maybe. I'm always searching. And the other thing that really had my interest in this second half of the Gospel of John was the connections that were made between power and virtue. All of the religions and many of the ancient philosophies and traditions seem to identify a link between living a virtuous life and gaining divine power. And the virtuous life that they're describing has nothing to do with whether you party or have sex out of marriage or are gay or straight or watch too much television or eat junk food or anything like that. It's none of the stuff that we as humans have projected onto this concept of virtue. Virtue, when you look at it on a clean slate with clean descriptions of it that come from philosophy and faith, is about being a person who is mindful, compassionate, understanding of others, self-aware, willing to learn from past experiences, and fair, and other things like that. When you think about all of the words that were being described in the Gospel of John and that appear in the various different belief systems, whether it be ancient Confucian belief systems from China or the Abrahamic religions or even anywhere else, the virtues that are expressed there have nothing to do with what your sexuality is or what you do for a living or whether you're good looking or anything, or whether you have money or whether you eat junk food or anything like that. Whether you're a good driver, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with being mindful, compassionate, understanding, self-aware, willing to learn from the past, and fair, and other things like that. And I think that there's something important there as well when it comes to the link between virtue and power. And that power is a tangible power that can help to manifest the light. That's the reason why I do this, to be able to see if I can find those connections. And I'm also curious about how we can seek and find this wisdom that we're all searching for, because apparently wisdom is also searching for us. My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Thank you to everyone who is listening today on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you would like to become a member of the KGRA viewership family and watch or listen to hosts like me or your other favorites while you chat in a live chat community with other watchers, experiencers, spiritualists, and weirdos like me, then just go to live.kgradb.com and choose promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.